These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them afar off, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But, as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. You probably recognize kind of the context of where this verse falls in. Hebrews 11, it's a chapter full of a list of these great heroes of faith found in Scripture, from Abel all the way through to David and Samuel and all the prophets after them. Some names you would think, okay, that makes sense that they're there. Abraham, Moses, David, these guys. And then there's some others that lesser known, maybe a little more questionable, like Gideon or Samson or Barak or Rahab. Some of them are hardly even mentioned, like Enoch or Abel. They're barely mentioned in the Bible. Even Moses' parents are mentioned in this chapter. Yet all of the people in this list have something in common. They were looking forward. They were seeking something. They were desiring something better. And what were they looking forward to here? They were looking forward to a homeland, it says in verse 14. They were looking forward to a country, a city, not one on this earth, but a heavenly one. And that's what it means to have faith. They didn't just believe in God. They believed that what he promised would come to pass either in this life or in the next. But they had something else in common. Look at verse 15. To have faith also means that you cannot look back, and return to the land, or try to return to the land that you came out of. For God's people throughout the history of the Bible, that was Egypt, wasn't it? Egypt comes up over and over and over again throughout the Bible. Obviously, Egypt plays a pretty big role in the history of Israel. They were there for 400 years in slavery. But even before and well after those years in Egypt, we read about its allure, its temptation, not just to the patriarchs before they were slaves in Egypt, and then to the kingdom period after they had left Egypt. They continued to long for what they perceived as the safety and prosperity that Egypt provided. But Egypt represents something more that even we today are tempted by. It represents a former life of slavery and sin that we as Christians must turn away from and must avoid and must not look back longingly. So this evening, what I want to do is just look at some of the many times that the idea of Egypt distracted and tempted God's people, and what resulted when that happened. Spoiler alert, nothing good. And then at the end of this lesson, I just want to kind of look at ourselves and consider what our Egypt is. We didn't come out of the physical land of Egypt, but we have an Egypt that we are constantly looking back at and hopefully trying to avoid as we move forward. We don't want to look back. We want to look forward, because we're looking forward to a better country and a better homeland and a better city. You might think, like I said, okay, Egypt, we're going back to Exodus, right? Moses, the 10 plagues. Well, actually, Egypt pops up way back, even way earlier than you might think, even before Joseph, when he was sold by his brothers into slavery. It actually pops up right at the beginning of the story of Abraham, so early that he's still called Abram, way back in Genesis chapter 12. And we'll see that during the time of the patriarchs, Egypt kind of represented this idea of safety, of comfort, of stability, even throughout all of Scriptures, and for good reason. Just the geographical layout of Egypt meant that it was kind of far away from the rest of the known world. So they didn't have quite as many people coming to try to conquer them as often. And they didn't have to worry quite as much about famines because they had the Nile River. It was kind of immune to drought. They didn't have to worry about not having rain. Well, the land of Canaan, the promised land, was kind of the opposite. It was reliant on rain and reliant on, and was constantly surrounded and bombarded by enemies. And you might think, well, that makes Egypt sound like a much better land than the land of Canaan. And, you might think, okay, yeah, that might be right. But remember, land of Canaan is called the land flowing with milk and honey. It has the potential to be a wonderful land, but it needed something else. It needed God to help them with that. So the people, they had to have a reliance on God to provide rain and provide protection there. Well, what does that require? That requires faith and trust. Down in Egypt, that didn't require that. So it kind of makes sense why God wanted them in a land that they would need his help and protection. That was the better land than the land of Egypt. They didn't have those difficulties in Egypt that they would in the promised land. So we see Abraham, or Abram as he's still called, in Genesis chapter 12. Literally, he's just come from his homeland, his original homeland back in Ur of the Chaldees. He's finally made the long trek. He's just gotten to the promised land, the land of Canaan, and immediately there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to stay there for a while because the famine in the land was severe. The text doesn't tell us if God approved of this trip or not, but we can kind of see the results of Abram leaving the promised land, searching for comfort and the comfort and safety that Egypt provide. In the next few verses, we kind of read about the trouble that Abram had because of his wife, Sarah. Pharaoh takes Sarah into his house. So God sends plagues on Pharaoh because he took Sarai, Abram's wife. A little kind of foreshadowing there is another time when God sends plagues on Pharaoh and because he was controlling his people there. Later on in the text, we are introduced to an Egyptian maidservant that Abram probably acquired from this time in Egypt. Her name was Hagar. A lot of trouble caused by her relationship with Abraham as well. So she's going to be at the center of some problems for them later. So just kind of notice this pattern starting early on here. There's trouble, there's difficulty, there's a famine. So God's people, they don't have that level of trust in God to save them. So what do? They look to Egypt for comfort, for refuge, for safety. And what does Egypt offer up instead? They end up having nothing but trouble, danger. Abram fears for his life. He gets kicked out of Egypt by Pharaoh because of all the trouble that all those plagues caused. So we also see this pattern of God rescuing his people and bringing them out of Egypt with a mighty hand. Again, we'll see that later on in scriptures. Skip to Isaac now. Abraham, Isaac, his son. Isaac's not immune to the allure of Egypt as well. There was another famine in Genesis 26, in addition to the one that occurred in Abraham's time. And Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, at Gerar. The Lord appeared to him and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land that I tell you about. Stay in this land as an alien, and I will be with you and bless you. For I will give you all these lands to you and your offspring, and I will confirm the oath that I swore to your father Abraham." Isaac, he would have probably known the story of Abram's time in Egypt and what happened and all the bad things that kind of happened while he was down there. Yet, here's this famine. Seems like he was heading that way. He was wanting to go down. And this time, the Lord said, "Don't do that. Don't go down." Isaac hadn't learned from that mistake, but fortunately for him, at least, I don't know what would have happened, but the Lord stopped him from going down. But that allure, that sense of Egypt was the safe place to be during this famine, that was still there. Jacob, of course, this is actually one of two times where God's people are told to go to Egypt. Jacob seems to have learned from the the mistakes of his father and grandfather. And when this is right in the middle of yet another famine. Of course, Joseph is already down there. He's invited. He wants to bring all his family down to kind of survive this 7 years of famine that was going on. Jacob seems to have some reservations about going down, and the Lord said in verse 3, "I am God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again, and Joseph will put his hand on your eyes." So he's a little more reserved about going down until the Lord gives him that okay. Of course, once Jacob and his 12 sons make it down there, they're going to be down there a long, long time. We kind of know the rest of the story with Joseph, and of course he spends 400 years down there, and during that time the Pharaoh comes up that does not remember Joseph, and he enslaves the people of Israel. And then as you get into the book of Exodus, we see Moses coming up, and Moses bringing his people out through, again, those plagues that we talked about. Pharaoh would harden his heart and would not let them go, and he continues to pursue them even after they left, pursues Israel to the Red Sea, where finally God delivers his people once and for all from the slavery and oppression of Egypt. And you would think, okay, they've been in Egypt for 400 years. They've been slaves for a big chunk of that time. There's no way, there's no possible way that these people would desire to go back to that life. And yet, the Israelites literally, we're barely a chapter or two away from the Red Sea. We're days past them finally getting out of the land of Egypt. And look at Exodus 16. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by pots of meat and ate all the bread we wanted. Instead, you brought us into the wilderness to make this whole assembly die of hunger." They go a day without food, and they're already wishing to go back to Egypt and get food. They'd forgotten, they had some food, but they were beaten and tormented and enslaved while they were down there. It seems to have slipped their minds right there. But even just that same generation that had experienced slavery was already wanting to go back. This idea of returning comes up so much in not just Exodus, but Numbers and Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the rest of that wilderness wandering period. Numbers 14, all the Israelites complained about Moses and Aaron, and the whole community told them, "If only we had died in the land of Egypt, and if only we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to die by the sword? Our wives and children will become plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" So they said to one another, "Let's appoint a leader and go back to Egypt." This is the time where they sent the spies into the land. And the spies came back and said, "We can't take this land. They're too great. We need to turn around." And they rebel against God and against Moses. So that generation just, even though they had seen these wonderful things that had happened to them, they had experienced slavery, they'd come out of it, and now they were free. Yet the moment things got tough, the moment they got a little hungrier, the moment they saw armies that were bigger than them, they lost their faith and their trust in God and wanted to go back to what they had in Egypt. Of course, that didn't turn out for that generation, did it? They end up wandering for 40 years, and that whole generation died off. Fast forward all the way to Solomon. Again, this idea is still, this idea of kind of raising Egypt on a pedestal is still there in the mindset, even during the days of Solomon. Solomon desired to be like Egypt. He makes a treaty with Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and marries his daughter as to bind the two nations together. In 1 Kings 4, it said, "Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt." You can kind of see the author is comparing we consider Solomon the wisest, but the author's saying, hey, they compare that to the wisdom of Egypt. They put Egypt, the East, and they put Egypt on this pedestal of they are wise, they are this great nation. They kind of raised them up, I think, a little bit higher than they should. Of course, this is probably the most egregious one. Solomon had horses imported from Egypt and Cava. The king's merchants bought them at Cava at the current price. Now, a chariot that was imported from Egypt cost 600 shekels of silver, and a horse 150. And they exported them to all the kings of the Hittites. What makes this so bad is back in Deuteronomy, Moses had kind of predicted what would happen. You're going to have a king one of these days. You'll surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. Well, here's the rules for the king. One from among your brethren you shall set as king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother, but he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Where did Solomon get his horses from? Egypt. He returned there. Got him a wife, one of many. Got him a bunch of horses, and the complete opposite of what was commanded of him to not to multiply horses. He shouldn't be looking back to Egypt to gain power. That the idea is that he should be relying on God for these things, not looking to Egypt. The Lord had warned them, "You shall not return that way again." Not just physically, but you can tell we're talking about hearts. Their hearts were still looking back to that time in Egypt. Even fast forward all the way into the divided kingdom period. At this point, Israel is no more. The northern kingdom has been taken into captivity. It's Judah alone. I was telling someone I should have just done another 17 time periods thing since we did that last week. I'll just do that again and teach the song. So we're in Judah alone right now, and Judah is hoping to be saved by Egypt some of the time. When the Assyrians were coming in and taking over people left and right, the only hope that Judah seemed to have was in Egypt. They forgot about God half the time. They were trying to rely on Egypt. This is the Assyrian general that was kind of mocking them for that. He says, "Now look, you are trusting in the staff of this broken reed, Egypt, on which if a man leans, it will go into his hand and pierce it. So is Pharaoh king of Egypt to all who trust him. How then will you repel one captain of the least of my master's servants and put your trust in Egypt for chariots and horsemen?" Well, that wasn't just someone else saying this about Israel. Well, here's Isaiah talking about this same mindset that was prevalent. They were hoping to get help from Egypt. "Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help and rely on horses, who trust in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they are very strong, but who do not look on the Holy One of Israel, nor seek the Lord. Now the Egyptians are men and not God. Their horses are flesh and not spirit. When the Lord stretches out his hand, both he who helps will fall, and he who is helped will fall down. They all will perish together." The Israelites just never seem to quite learn this lesson. Put your trust in the Holy One of Israel. Seek the Lord. The Egyptians were men. Their horses were flesh. The Lord was ruler of all these things. He was way more powerful than them, but they were constantly looking behind them and looking back. And that's because Egypt, we'll see Egypt just kind of represents not just looking back to an old life, but it really represents slavery and sin. Whenever Moses talked about Egypt, he reminded them, seemed like every time, that they were slaves there. "Remember this day in which you went out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. For by strength of hand the Lord brought you out of this place." In Leviticus, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that you should not be their slaves. I have broken the bands of your yoke and made you walk upright." He doesn't talk about Egypt fondly. He talks about Egypt correctly. Egypt was a place of slavery, of bondage, of sin, of bad things happened there. Even though the Israelites were having some trouble at the time, is because of their sin and their disobedience. If they would just trust in the Lord, he would provide them with all those things that they thought Egypt would provide. Yet that required faith, that required trust, and that sometimes just didn't happen to them. Deuteronomy 6, when your son asks you in time to come, saying, what is the meaning of the testimonies, the statutes, and the judgments which the Lord our God has commanded you? Then you shall say to your son, we were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. The Lord showed signs and wonders before our eyes, great and severe against Egypt and Pharaoh and all his house. Then he brought us out from there, that he might bring us in to give us the land which he swore to our fathers. Moses here in Deuteronomy is trying to remind them over and over, don't look back. Look forward. Think forward. Think of what God has done for us, and then remember his promises of what he is going to do for us. And his promises are true. His promises always come about. He has brought us out. He is bringing us into a better land than the land of Egypt, yet it just seemed like the Israelites preferred the bondage of Egypt to the freedom offered by God. And again, we always kind of get onto the Israelites. We say, if I was there, I wouldn't have done that. Well, we have our own Egypt that we have to deal with. It's our former life of slavery and sin. Before we do that, go to open to Romans. I wanted to actually turn there. So if you got your Bible, open to Romans chapter 6. Romans chapter 6 and verse 16. We'll read a couple verses here, and hopefully we can understand that we are the Israelites. We have been brought out of Egypt in a sense here. Look at verse 16 in Romans chapter 6. Don't you know that if you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of that one you obey, either of sin leading to death or of obedience leading to the righteousness? But thank God that although you used to be slaves of sin, you obeyed from the heart that pattern of teaching to which you were handed over. And having been set free from sin, you became enslaved to righteousness. We were enslaved. We were enslaved to sin. And we needed someone that we had no power to overcome that. We needed someone to bring us out of that land of slavery, and God did that. He brought us out and set us free from sin, that we can, it says, to be enslaved to righteousness. We serve a much better master, to the point that we are considered free by serving God, much more free than we could have ever been. By serving sin and being enslaved to sin. And of course, how did God do that? He sent his son to us. And we'll see that Egypt even comes up in the story of Christ. Christ leads the way out of Egypt. God didn't just say, all right, you need to leave, or you need to get out of slavery yourself. He sent his one and only son to show us how to do that. Notice some of these verses. This is basically baby Jesus, his beginning right here in Matthew chapter 2. Remember that the king at the time, Herod, had heard that Jesus had been born. He's killing off all of the babies at his age. So what did they do? Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Arise, take the young child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there until I bring you word. For Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. Right off the bat, if you haven't read the whole story, if you've been reading from Genesis 1 all the way to this point, and you hear the name Egypt again, and here's Christ, he's heading to Egypt. Uh-oh. That's bad news, right? That hasn't ended well for like the last 12 times that's happened that we've seen. But look what happens. When he arose, he took the young child, his mother by night. They departed for Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, out of Egypt I called my son. Christ returns. He comes out of Egypt, and he is not going back. He is not looking back like the Israelites often did. He is showing us the example of how to lead a life of freedom, lead a life outside, a life looking forward to a better country. We know he was tempted with the same temptations that the Israelites faced. If you read about the three temptations of Jesus in Matthew chapter 4, a lot of the same ones that the Israelites kind of were tempted by. He's tempted by food. He was hungry. That was like half the story of Numbers right there. It's just like every other chapter. Oh, I'm hungry. Let's go back to Egypt. I'm hungry. I'm thirsty. Let's go back to Egypt. Jesus Christ was tempted in that same way. Yet, what did he say? Man shall not live by bread alone. He overcame that temptation. He was tempted by comfort. Satan was like, "Oh, the angels, jump off here. The angels will catch you. They won't let you stumble." No, he was able to overcome that temptation. Just having earthly or worldly comfort wasn't worth it to him. He wanted to obey. He didn't want to offer his allegiance to Satan just to be comforted in this lifetime. And of course, he was tempted by power to control all the nations, the kingdoms of this world. The Israelites were constantly looking back to Egypt for safety, for power to defend themselves. Christ overcame that same exact temptation. Hebrews 2 talks about Christ. Therefore, in all things he had to be made like his brethren, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For in that he himself has suffered, being tempted, he is able to aid those who are tempted. He was made just like us. He's going through the exact same journey that we do, that the Israelites do, and he never desired to return to Egypt. He instead chose to suffer and die, so that through his sacrifice, Egypt, this slavery, this sin, could be defeated once and for all. So let's get to the application. What does that mean for us? What is our Egypt? Again, I don't know if anyone's actually been to the physical land of Egypt. Most of us haven't. We definitely were not enslaved in the country of Egypt like the Israelites were, but we have been slaves. We were slaves to sin, to desires, temptations, all those things that we had in our former life, and we're still tempted to look back on those, aren't we? Things that hopefully we set aside when we became Christians and we dedicated our life to Christ. But it's easy to look back on those things longingly, to turn back and not have our eyes forward on what was coming. It could be something like a past desire, temptation, sexual temptation, substance abuse, anything like that. Those things that draw our hearts and draw our minds away, things of this world that can be our Egypt. It might just be just a time in our life that we kind of look back and think, oh, that was an easier time. That was a simpler time. I know a lot of people kind of look back at those couple months of, or I guess a year of like COVID, when just there were things that were difficult, but then things were easier. We didn't have to get out and talk to people about anything. We could sit in our homes and worship on Zoom, on Sunday mornings, and eat Cheetos and, keep our Crocs on or whatever, those were easier times, right? In a sense. And, those can be temptations. They might have been easier, but were those times better for us? My thing is, I think back to the days when I didn't have any children or wife or responsibilities. I was in college. Those were just easy, fun days. All I had to worry about was just having fun and doing whatever I wanted. And those were simpler times, right? Well, was I better, a stronger Christian back then than I am now? Absolutely not. I've learned so much by being a father and a husband. And yes, it's harder, it's more responsibilities, but I have a much more forward-focused mindset than I did back then. I was living in the now or living in the world at that time, thinking of, okay, what do I want to do that's fun? What do I want to do that's enjoyable? Those kind of things can be your Egypt as well. Might be a person or a relationship. I know, what's the relation? Backsliding, when you you're thinking back to like a former girlfriend or something, and you go back to them, or hopefully not that you're married and then you go back to them, but you're just like, oh, I miss that old girlfriend. Maybe I'll try to get back together with her or something. Those can be those types of relationships, or those people can be your Egypt. They are dragging you back to a time when maybe you aren't as strong or as good of a servant of Christ as you should be. Keeping your mindset on things of this world, that can be your Egypt. A job or a hobby or activity, anything that is keeping our focus away from looking forward. We're focusing on the things of this world. Those can be our Egypt. Oh, I've got to achieve this level at my job, or make this amount of money, or that's the most important thing right now. Well, why do we do that? Why do we need that much money or that much success? Hopefully that's providing more comfort and safety, those things that Egypt was providing to them, right? Those we feel safer when we've got a nice big nest egg in our bank accounts. Well, God wants us to trust in Him, that He is going to provide exactly what we need. And if something came up, hey, that's why we have a church family, things like that. Those are our that's our safety net. That's where our comfort should come from, not just this amazing job or this great nest egg, or all of our hobbies and activities. Those are fine, but are those taking up our time and our energy and our focus when we should be focused on moving forward? Those are things that are of this world. They're not going to be around. We're looking forward to a better country, a better activities, or better things that we will be doing looking forward. Remember Moses' words here. He told the Israelites, don't look back to Egypt. Don't return to Egypt. You shall not return that way again. What would happen if they did? Well, nothing good when they went down to Egypt. Nothing good happened. They would lose their focus on things that they should. So, do you still have one of those lists? Did that apply to us? Do you still desire Egypt? Well, here's a couple verses to hopefully help us, to encourage us not to focus on those worldly things, but look forward to our heavenly homeland and our heavenly country that is being provided to us. Hebrews 1, therefore, the next verse, we started in Hebrews 11, now we're in Hebrews 12. Therefore, since we are surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses, all those men and women of faith that we saw, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely or so easily ensnares us. That's that Egypt that's trying to draw us back. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and the perfecter of our faith. Looking to Him. He is our example. Focus on Him. Keep that laser focus on Him, who for the joy that was set before Him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Philippians 3, look at this one. Brothers, I do not consider that I have made it my own, but one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead, I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Let those of us who are mature think this way. Are we mature Christians? Is that our mindset? Are we looking forward toward the goal, or are we looking back? And if anything you think otherwise, God will reveal that also to you. If you are thinking otherwise, He will reveal that to you as well. Look back at our verse that we started with, Hebrews 11, verse 13. Those all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar. They were looking forward. They saw them, they died. They didn't get to, a lot of them didn't get to make it to the promised land, but most of them, I guess, didn't make it into the promised land. But for people who speak thus, verse 14, they make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. If you're looking back to Egypt, you can go there. It's a really easy trip back there. But that's not the type of people we want to be. We want to be like these examples. We want to be like Christ, looking forward, following his example. But as it is, verse 16, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. And what happens when we have that forward mindset, that focus, when we leave Egypt? Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. He has prepared us a city. He's not ashamed of us. Notice it didn't say everything will go right in this world and you'll have comfort and safety and all those things in this world. No, unfortunately not. But we're not worried about this world. We're forward focused. We're leaving Egypt. We're leaving this world of sin. We're leaving this land of slavery behind. We're looking forward. We've seen them. We're greeting them afar off. We acknowledge that we are strangers and exiles in this land. So, have you even left Egypt yet? If you've never been baptized, if you've not started your walk forward through Christ, through baptism in Christ, you're still slaves. You're still enslaved by sin. Look at 1 Corinthians 10. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud. All passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank of the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Even generations before Christ shows up in the narrative, Christ was there in the Red Sea. And how did they get out? What was the path that they took? Well, they followed Christ. They were baptized into Moses through the cloud and the sea. That is our same path. Can you see the connections? Even though we are not those Israelites, we are following the same path that they took, that Christ took for us. We have that same path. We are trying to get out of Egypt, and we are trying to head toward the promised land just like they did. And the path that they had to take was through the water, right? We have that same path as well. Therefore, we were buried with him through baptism into death, that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. Through Christ's example, he was raised up. We can be raised up again through baptism into his death. So, are you ready to leave yet? Hopefully, I know most of you pretty well by now. We have that same mindset. We're looking forward. We are leaving Egypt behind. You would think, talking about all this turning around, somewhere in there I'd mention Lot's wife turning around, turning into a pillar of salt. Didn't even get to her at all. There's plenty of other examples, but don't turn back and look to that former life in Egypt. That's a land of slavery. That is a life of slavery and sin. Look forward to the freedom and the peace that we will have by leaving Egypt and heading to heaven. So if you're ready to leave, if you're ready to leave that former life of sin and pass through the waters of baptism, then please do so right now as we come forward. And please come forward.